traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and of sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of the imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop, the narrow mind.
All right, Tuesday night, the 28th of July. Wow, can you believe it? The summer's really going by fast. Welcome to The Narrow Mind. My name is Gene Cook. I will be your host for the next 60 minutes. The Narrow Mind is a weekly webcast that comes on every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And it's a place where we discuss God, His world, our place in it. We discuss controversial issues. We discuss Christian doctrine. Basically anything that has to do with God or His Word. And tonight is no exception. But before I introduce you to my guest, I just want to bring a couple of announcements to your attention. We had our debate last Saturday night. That was the 24th with Mr. Kelly Powers of Apologetics for Christians Ministry, and I think it went rather well. You can actually listen if you missed that debate. You can listen for free for a few more days if you go to the homepage at unchainedradio.com. You can download it there. You'll see kind of a bold print that says free downloads. You'll find 3 downloads there. You'll find last week's edition of The Narrow Mind up until tomorrow, and then this week's edition of The Narrow Mind will replace it. And then you'll find a new program that we're featuring on Unchained Radio called the Cineplex Pulpit, where a friend of mine by the name of Trey Austin is my co-host, and we go out weekly and watch movies and evaluate them from a Reformed perspective. And then you'll also find the MP3 from the debate that took place last Saturday night, July 24th. That will remain on the homepage until Saturday. So I would encourage you to go check that out. Tonight, however, there's not going to be any edition of the Cineplex Pulpit, but next Tuesday night, we will be reviewing the movie King Arthur. And so if you haven't seen that, you might want to go check it out. Tune in on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock and hear a couple of guys that are in ministry talk about the theological implications of King Arthur. Well, I also want to mention something else. On Saturday, August 7th, I will be having a debate in San Diego, California. This will be a live debate. I will be debating a man by the name of Derek Sansone, who is a very vocal and I suppose outspoken agnostic or atheist, and we're going to be discussing the question, does God exist? This is going to take place at the First Congregational Church in La Mesa. And if you'd like more information on that, you can look at the homepage at unchainedradio.com. I'd also like to take just a moment and welcome our new audience that listens now on sermonaudio.com. If you haven't been over to the website, I'd encourage you to go over there, unchainedradio.com, and check that out. Register as a user if you'd like to get weekly updates as to what our topics and who our guests are going to be. Well, tonight I have with me a guest, a man by the name of Zachery Moore. And Zachery is someone I met when I was surfing on the website, xchristians.net. I think that's how you say it. And I typed in, an invitation. I found a thread that was entitled, "Where are all the Christians?" or something to that effect. And so I typed in that I would like to have a live discussion on my webcast concerning the issue of belief and unbelief. And Zachery Moore was kind enough to respond, and so I scheduled him to be with me tonight. Zachery, I'd like to welcome you to The Narrow Mind.
Thanks a lot, Gene. Thanks for having me on. And if I could, I'd like to give a special hello to any and all members of xchristian.net that may be listening tonight.
Okay. They're great. I'd like to say hello to them also.
Mm-hmm.
And welcome to Unchained Radio, The Narrow Mind.
Well, thank you.
Okay, well, I'd like to begin by talking to you, Zachery, about some of the things that I already know about you.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know very much about you. You mentioned that you were raised in a Reformed home. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, actually, both my father and mother came to Reformed theology. My father, by way of the Disciples of Christ church, with a short stop in the Messianic Jewish church. My mom came from a Lutheran background. And we belonged to a church in Cincinnati. That's actually where I live and where I grew up. It was called simply Reformed Baptist Church. And it was pastored by a man named Tom Wells. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard of him. I know he's written a number of books on theology. He's actually still preaching. He's getting on in years. And the church has actually moved, and the changed names. It's now called King's Chapel, and he co-pastors that with a man by the name of Newton Bush. So
okay.
I don't know if those names ring any bells.
Tom Wells seems to did you say Tom Wells?
Yeah, Tom Wells.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he actually, he and another Reformed, a guy by the name of Baruch Maoz, he's a Jewish Christian, Reformed Jewish.
From Jerusalem?
The Reform is on the Christian part, not the Jewish part.
Right. Is he from Jerusalem?
Yes.
I've met him before. He was a chapel speaker at Westminster Seminary here in
Oh
California.
yeah, I've had dinner with him. He's a very, very intelligent guy. But he and Tom Wells jointly married my parents. He was a good friend of my father's also.
Okay.
So that's pretty much, I don't know if that gives you any clues.
Okay. Well, how long have you been an apostate, as you called yourself?
About 5 years, I would say. And it's not the type of thing that happens overnight, certainly. It was a gradual process that just, I guess, sort of happened.
Mm-hmm.
I can take you through that a little bit more in detail if you'd like.
Yeah, I'd like to find out maybe what it was. You said that in the email that you sent me, you said that there were several reasons for your apostasy. I was wondering maybe if you could go into a few of those.
Sure. Well, first of all, I guess I should start at the beginning. You know, when I was a child, of course, I gave a little bit about the church that I grew up in, and my father was very, very, he had very, very high expectations of my spiritual development, and he placed a large amount of importance on biblical literacy. And so beyond just, going to church and going to Sunday school and all that stuff, on Sunday afternoon when we returned home after lunch, myself and my brothers actually were all assigned books of the Bible that we had to read an entire book that afternoon and either write a written report or give him an oral report on that. Mm-hmm. And so in doing so, I became very biblically literate. I've read the Bible many, many times over.
Did you resent your father doing that?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I mean, it was, at times it was a pain, especially, as I became an adolescent, it's like, well, I'd love to go out to play, but man, I got to read this book of the Bible. So, it was a good day when I had to read like Jude, and it was a bad day when I had to read Isaiah.
Okay.
Usually, to be fair, he'd split up Isaiah into two parts, but at any rate. And so, beyond that, throughout like junior high school, he would give me books by J.I. Packer and Charles Spurgeon, and I'd read through those, and I accepted, pretty much everything that I read. I had faith in it as soon as I was old enough to sort of realize the concept of sin and redemption and all that. I prayed the sinner's prayer, and I was very, I was believing. I had faith. There's really no other way to put it. I mean, there was no way that I would even consider not having faith. And quite frankly, if I could have, at that time, looked ahead to where I am now, I never would have believed it. You couldn't have paid me enough money to believe that this is where I would be.
So, I mean, how do you, having a Reformed background, just as a point of question, I guess, how do you look at yourself? I mean, there was one time when you believed that, I'm sure the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints,
right?
You couldn't lose your salvation,
right? Well, yeah, I'm aware of those doctrines, and obviously by those doctrines, I was never really saved in the first place. But you couldn't have told me that at the time, certainly. And quite honestly, I was no different, absolutely no different from any other. I'm sure you have a lot of kids in your Sunday school or whatever. Mm-hmm. I was no different from any of them. Given a few changes in my life, a few things that might have gone differently, I could have easily ended up pastoring a church just like you are, probably with a lot of the same doctrines. So it's kind of funny how things work out that way.
It is. Yeah. It is. So one was, you haven't really got to the reasons why you went apostate. So
right. Yeah, I take a long time to get to anything.
Okay.
But as I grew up, my worldview began to expand, and this is something that happens to everybody. I mean, when you're a little kid, your world is centered on your parents, and as you grow up, you begin to realize that there is a world outside your parents. There is something bigger than them, and I began to get sort of I would call it an objective perspective on the world. I realized that in any situation, there is your story, there is my story, and then there's the truth. And some of your story may encompass the truth, some of mine may encompass the truth, but there's all these different sides, and so you really have to look at it from all these different ways. And I think perspective is really the crux of what led to my apostasy, I think. Having a larger perspective. If you go to Egypt and you visit the pyramids, if you fly over them, you look down and say, wow, what big squares. And if you drive past them, you look over and say, wow, what big triangles. And in both situations, you'd be right. It's just a different perspective, And it's like the story of the blind men with the elephant. They're each grabbing a different part of the elephant, and they're each completely missing what they're talking about. One thinks it's a rope, one thinks it's a wall,
But the difference between Christianity and the analogy of the elephant is you have somebody up on the balcony yelling, it's an elephant.
Well, so they say.
Okay.
Right. And anyway, so I was growing up, and I had this larger perspective on just the world, and for a long time, I would shine this light of objectivity, if you will, just about everywhere, on any situation, but I kept it away from my faith. And I think, looking back, I think there were some things that I was kind of queasy about. Certainly a lot of the killing and, most of the objections about the Old Testament. I was aware of those type of things. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really like to think about them. And so I would be objective about just about everything else except for my own faith. And it was about this time that I entered into college, and I took a course that I thought would be an easy A for me. That's pretty much the only reason I took it. It was called The Bible as Literature. It was taught by a man named Anthony York, who's actually written a book that we actually use as a textbook called The Bible as Literature and Introduction. He's written it with two other guys, John Gable and Charles Wheeler. And it basically added another realm of perspective on the Bible. And I began to look at it as a work of literature. And I don't know if you know any of the critical analyses in terms of biblical literature that exist. The documentary, hypothesis, the Yahwist source.
Yeah, I haven't taken courses on them as you have, but I am familiar with them enough. I've been exposed to them. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, if anybody out there is interested, I highly recommend that book for giving you an idea of what those things are. But I think the most important thing that it allowed me to do was to look at the Bible as a human work, which, I mean, Christians do believe that it is a human work inspired by, the Holy Spirit or God, whatever. Mm-hmm. But at least at one level, it is a human work, and I was able to truly look at it as a human work. And from that perspective, I could see all types of new things in there, layers of theology, the different sources that I mentioned before, the documentary theory of the Gospels, different layers in the Gospels, beginning with Mark, expanding through Matthew and Luke and John, being something completely different.
Did you expect them to be exactly the same?
Boy, you mean exactly the same accounts? No. But and
so,
there are things.
It's them being different isn't necessarily a problem.
Well, I don't just mean that they're different. I don't mean to gloss over these type of things, but this is to fully explain these would take an hour in a.
Okay.
If you're interested in it, I can recommend some things where you can read up on it and see exactly what I'm talking about. But anyway, so I'm seeing all these different layers, these definite human fingerprints, sort of smudging my Bible, and it was kind of a problem for me.
Could you just give us an example, maybe of one?
Yeah, actually, probably the most important one, and the one that really kind of there was no real place where I would say that here's where my faith really started to crumble away. But this was a big part of it. There's a totally new perspective that I found on the Garden of Eden. As it relates to original sin. Original sin, of course, being the central tenet that Christianity is based on. I mean, if there is no sin, then there's no need for redemption, and
yes.
What are we doing going to church? Now, in the Christian doctrine, and this is the way it is because this is the way Paul interpreted this. Man and woman disobeyed God, and they fell from grace or perfection, whatever, and that is transcendent upon us, right? The headship of Adam and all that. Well, if you look at it in a mythological perspective, which it certainly can be looked at in that way, it certainly does qualify at any rate. You have a talking animal. You have a moral lesson. By definition, this is a fable, or at least a myth, at least on one level. And what you're seeing is, before the fall, you have Adam and Eve, and they're naked, and they don't know it. That's important. They're naked, and they're not even aware that they're naked. And all of their wants and needs are provided for. They don't have to worry about anything. They eat what they want. There's nothing that they have to do. After the fall, there's a difference in their perception. They are aware of good and evil. Before they weren't. They know what the difference is between good and evil now. And there are a number of other differences. And if I can quote from Genesis 3, Yahweh tells Eve, basically, he says, I shall give you great labor in childbearing. With labor you will bear children. You will desire your husband, but he will be your master. And to the man he says, on your account the earth will be cursed. You will get your food from it only by labor, all the days of your life. It will yield thorns and thistles for you. You will eat of the produce of the field, and only by the sweat of your brow will you win your bread. So, after the fall, not only they're able to tell the difference between good and evil, but Eve has, she gives birth. She, becomes like the property of her husband, and she has to do what he says. And Adam, he has to go out and work and sweat and, earn a day's bread every day. So, before the fall, they're essentially children. I mean, they have no cares. They don't know right from wrong. Everything's provided for them. Afterwards, they do know what's right and wrong. They have to wear clothes. They feel shame if they're not wearing clothes. Adam has to work for a living, and Eve has to, she gets pregnant and has babies. And so what this seems to me to be, at least apparent to me, is a myth explaining why children grow up to become adults. And there's other myths.
And what is the answer to that question? Why children grow up to become adults?
Yes, it answers that question.
And what is the answer to that question?
Because Adam and Eve did this certain thing.
Okay. Are you aware that Jesus Christ actually spoke of Adam and Eve becoming one flesh? He spoke of them as real historical characters?
Well, the character Jesus did, yes.
So you don't believe that Jesus was a real person?
Well, Jesus may or may not have been a real person. I don't really know. I tend to doubt it.
Well, then I suggest you be careful when you call him a character. If you're not sure.
When I talk about, when you're quoting Jesus, you're quoting Jesus from the Gospel.
Right? I am, yes.
Well, the Jesus that's in the Gospel, I would say, is a literary character. There may have been a Jesus that actually existed.
Okay.
And he may have said some of the things that got into the Gospels, but I think by and large, what Jesus says, or the things that Jesus says in the Gospels, you're talking about a literary character, at least to my perspective.
And that you were persuaded of that perspective by taking a college course and reading a book about it.
Oh, well, more than just one book. I mean, it really opened up my eyes, and I started reading. I wanted to find out more and more about this. I mean, if this was true, I wanted to see what was really going on. So I started reading all kinds of stuff. I read J.D. Crossan, John Mayer, Donald Harmon Atkinson, wrote a great book actually called Surpassing Wonder, which is about the invention of the Bible and the Talmud. Karen Armstrong, the history of God. So this is not something that one guy out there has just kind of thought up and put into a book.
No, I understand it.
Yeah.
This is those that reject Christianity. This is a common theme among the natural men, among natural men. In fact, the Book of Romans speaks of natural man suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, resisting that which God reveals in nature about himself, and choosing to worship the creature rather than the Creator. And so, from my Christian worldview, obviously you don't agree with my Christian worldview, but from my Christian worldview, even that which I see concerning these men writing these books and teaching these classes seems to be consistent with the testimony that I find in Scripture.
Well, yeah. I mean, but the where you find that, Paul wrote that, right? In
Inspired
Romans?
by the Holy Spirit.
Well, okay. But, I mean, humans are humans the world over and since time began. And, what's the difference between a human back then and human now? I mean, are you saying that Paul predicted this? I mean, I think Paul was just observing that in his own time and just saying... Well,
yeah, but Paul is giving us a reasonable explanation for the way things are.
Well, sure. Well, that's what theology is. It's figuring out explanations for things that aren't readily obvious, I guess.
So do you reject the concept of a God altogether now?
See, that's a tough one. It's nearly impossible to reject the concept of a God in sort of like a theist sense. But then it's also impossible to reject the concept of any God, or at least disprove them. I hesitate to characterize myself as an atheist because, I mean, I'm certainly you would object to be calling an atheist because you don't believe in Vishnu. I don't think that the God of the Bible exists. I don't know that to be 100% fact, but I think it's probably, at least by the things that I have concluded, the things that I have seen, by my own reasoning, I don't think. I don't want to say that no, he doesn't exist, but I say I don't think he exists.
Okay, you're listening to The Narrow Mind. My name is Gene Cook. I have with me tonight as my guest Zachery Moore. Zachery was raised in a Christian home. In case you just tuned in, you didn't catch the beginning of the broadcast. If you'd like to get in on this conversation, you're more than welcome to give us a call. Our toll-free number is 1-800-466-1873. That's 1-800-466-1873. And I'd like to encourage you also, those of you that are not listening from the UnchainedRadio.com website, I'd like to encourage you to check that out and register as users if you'd like to receive these weekly updates announcing who our guests are going to be and the topic that we're going to be discussing. Now, Zachery, let me ask you a personal question if I can.
Sure.
Do you feel that you were somehow damaged by your Christian upbringing?
No, not really.
You don't have any resentment?
No, and, it's funny. A lot of people, I'm actually kind of, well, at least from the people that I run into on xchristian.net, there are a lot of people that come to that site who really have been damaged.
Mm-hmm.
And they're full of anger. And that's really the whole purpose of that site, is to provide sort of a supportive environment for people who, for whatever reason, whether they've been hurt or whether they've just, come to some sort of intellectual conclusion that they can't hold these beliefs. It's just to provide a support mechanism for them mostly. And there are a lot of people that come in and, and there's some pretty disturbing stories. You should check some of them out.
Well, I've heard, you're right, there are some disturbing stories. There's no denying that. Mm-hmm. This, once again, I think is consistent with institutions being, erected that do not accurately hold to what the Bible teaches, number one. Number two, even in those situations where there is biblical theology, you have an abuse of power or the active sinful nature of men that can lead to all kinds of evils. Zachery, we've got a caller here, and let's bring him on and see what he has to say. Hello, and welcome to The Narrow Mind. I'm going to have to ask you to turn down your speakers if you can.
Hello?
Yeah. Can you turn down your speakers for me, please?
This is Derek.
Oh, Derek. How you doing? You're on the air.
I'm on the air right now.
My screener is camping this week, but I need you to turn down your speakers if you can.
No problem.
Okay, Zachary, this is a gentleman that I'm going to be debating in August, and he says that he knows you. I actually spoke to him earlier today.
Yeah, I actually know him.
Okay, great.
How's everybody doing?
Good. So what's on your mind, Derek?
Well, I wanted to talk to you guys about, Gene, I want to talk to you about Romans 1:20 through 21. When Paul makes the claim from, I think his suppositions as a Pharisee, about all men knowing God by nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, I don't know, I just think that it is question-begging. I wanted to see if you agreed with that. If it, obviously, if I don't know something, I don't know it. And if you present something to me and I'm not convinced, then is it my fault that I'm not convinced? But, you know, if you show me something objective, I really don't have much to fight about it. You know, if you show me a candle and you go, this is a candle, I say, really, it is a candle. I don't really think it's not a candle. It's not a baseball bat. It's pretty objective. It's a candle.
Right.
Now, I might not like the way it smells. That's subjective. But the bottom line is that that's an objective piece of information that I cannot deny. I can't run and say, I don't believe in this. I mean, it's pretty cut and dry. But when Paul makes the claim that all men know God by nature, don't you think that's a little tough? Don't you think that's kind of a push?
I think it's 100% true.
But what is the truth based on?
Well, let me give you an example. I just asked Zachary, do you believe that no God exists? Are you saying that there is no God? And he was very hesitant to say, yes, there is no God. And the reason for that is because he's not sure. He believes that maybe the Christian God, it doesn't exist. But I would say that the explanation for that is exactly what Paul is saying there in Romans chapter 1, because all men by nature know that God exists by the nature that has been revealed in the creation, or the nature of God that's been revealed in the creation. So in other words, when you look at a sunset or you look at a baby, these are all natural things that bear witness to God's existence.
But is that the only explanation for those material things that you see?
Yes.
Why is that the only explanation?
Because it's the true explanation.
But you're begging the issue because you're not showing that it's God that created it. You're just postulating a creator.
No, I'm not
That's
postulating.
not objective truth.
Right. I'm not postulating it. God is. I'm simply telling you what God's Word says. Now,
right,
the fact
but then we're going to go back and go, okay, well, how do we know that that's God's Word? And then you can't. That's not distinguishable as God's Word. That obviously has many problems with just within the Christian camp of understanding whose Holy Spirit is convicting them on the truth or not. And so you're just basically making more assumptions, and Paul's making assumptions.
Well, the difference is that I believe that my assumptions comport with reality, and that my Christian worldview is a precondition for knowledge, epistemology.
Well, that's fine and good, but you're still not giving us the only explanation that's possible.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm more than eager to hear yours when you come down to San Diego on August 8th. But
I know you are.
I'm going to have to let you go, Derek.
No problem.
We got
Take
plenty
it
to
easy,
talk
guys.
about. Okay, thank you. All right, Zach. Any comments concerning Derek's comments?
Well, actually, I was going to say, you're saying that when you were talking about that God is evident to all mankind.
Yes.
I was just thinking of another course I actually took in college that was it was an overview of religion in various cultures. And what anthropologists have found is that at the lowest levels of organization in societies, there is no conception of the metaphysical at the lowest.
That's not what I see on Discovery Channel there, Zachary. When we take our cameras into Africa or in the outback in Australia, it seems to me that they're all religious.
I'm talking about the very, very lowest. I mean, you find what are called clans, where the entire society is just basically one extended family. I doubt you've run across many of those. But they actually have no conception. And when you get one higher, you get what are called tribes, in which are several clans together. And now they do develop a sort of a conception of the metaphysical, but they only believe in witches or witch doctors, certain individuals that can manipulate the spirit world. Once you get higher into, I believe they're called chiefdoms, which are groups of tribes, then they believe in sort of like an animism, that there's a spirit force in all things in nature. And I think that might be a little bit closer to what you might be experienced with. Once you get higher than that, then they start to believe in like gods that, and they tend to be a little bit more pantheic.
So I'm just a question, and I don't mean this in any wrong way. So are you identifying yourself with the lowest level of mankind by your position?
Not necessarily.
It seems that you are. Zach, we got another call. Let's bring him on.
Okay.
Welcome to Narrow Mind. This is Gene Cook. What's your name?
Paul.
Paul. How you doing, Paul?
Pretty good.
Good. What's on your mind?
I just want to jump in at the tail end of the discussion about Romans 1, all men knowing God.
Okay. Go ahead. You're on.
Hello?
You're on the air, Paul.
Oh, Gene.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Good. Good. You're on the air.
I just want to comment on what Derek called in.
Okay, go for it.
Talking about Romans 1.
Go for it.
And there's a vital premise that was missing. The reason that he was saying, well, he doesn't know it, is because men self-deceive themselves. So all men know God, but at the same time, they deceive themselves to believe that they don't know God. And to bring up that it's a question-begging position, it is on both ends. Since this is a worldview debate, on both ends, it's question-begging. So we assume our worldview, and we say that based on our worldview, all men know that God exists. There are no such things as atheists. And to come and just say, well, I don't know that God exists, is just to assume that Paul is wrong in Romans 1, and thus beg the question on your own end.
I would agree with that. Any comments on that, Zach?
Not really.
Okay. Thanks for the call, Paul.
No problem.
I'll tell you what, we're not going to take any more calls tonight because I'd really like to talk to my guest. His name is Zachery Moore, and I'd like to get to know him a little bit better. Okay, so do you believe then in evolution? I mean, when you look at the world, you look at creation, how do you believe everything came into existence?
Well, I actually am a scientist. I'm about a year away from my PhD in molecular biology. And as a scientist, I've seen the papers, I've seen the data. This is what I've been taught, and I believe that evolution describes how organisms develop.
Okay, and when it comes to, you mentioned earlier in the broadcast, you mentioned truth. You were talking about analyzing things from different perspectives, and you used the word truth. I'm wondering, can you explain to me a little bit about how the concept of truth works into an evolutionary worldview?
Well, you're talking about like objective truth, like absolute truth in a Platonic sense?
Well, maybe we should define truth. How do you define truth, Zachery?
Well, I mean, truth in the only practical sense that we can ever hope to grasp is just reality. And reality, I believe, as Philip K. Dick says, is what still remains when you stop believing in it. Now, whatever that means, I'm not sure. But in terms of truth, I'm just saying what actually exists. Is it possible to perceive the entirety of truth? No. I mean, nobody can do that.
But is it possible to know things that are true?
It is impossible to know within a great degree of certainty that things are true. It's not, you can't absolutely know that things are true. Evolution may be wrong. I mean, it may be wrong, but according to the methodologies of science, it is accepted. We have established procedures, statistical methods for determining whether we'll believe something scientifically or not. And even, it's interesting. People don't really know this about science. I actually just published a paper. When you publish the paper, it is not just snapped up and accepted. There's a great deal of skepticism in science for everything, and that's really a good thing because it helps you defend your position. People, if you introduce an idea that people are skeptical about, they will look into it, they will challenge it, they will look at it from a different way, and a different way and a different way. And you have, maybe 100 different people looking at it from 100 different ways. And if you have that many people with that many perspectives looking at it, that's really the best way. It's really the only way that we as humans can arrive at whatever you would consider as truth, or at least as close to it as you can get.
Well, that seems somewhat mysterious to me. So
Okay.
you're basically, your thesis is then that truth is established by numbers, by vote.
No.
Okay. If you say on the one hand that we really can't know anything to be true 100%, and then you say on the other hand that there is a great deal of skepticism in the scientific world, it seems to me that if we can't know anything 100%, then it's all skepticism in the scientific world.
Oh, it is. And in fact, there are some things in science that have been historically accepted just dogmatically as matter of faith, sort of as a religious concept. In fact, this was shattered when retroviruses were first discovered. For the longest time, the central doctrine of molecular biology was DNA creates RNA creates protein, and this is something that had been tested and experimentally shown to be true over and over and over again, and it was just accepted as truth. And some scientists accepted it a little bit as absolute truth. There's nothing that could violate this central thesis. Mm-hmm. But then along come retroviruses, and retroviruses don't follow the central doctrine. They go RNA, DNA, RNA protein. And so, when that first came out, people were challenging that, and they didn't believe it. And experiment after experiment after experiment showed that in fact that was true. So in science, what we believe is true conditionally until something else comes along to replace it, or something else comes along that shows that that's not true.
I mean, for example, is it true that 2 + 2 = 4?
Yeah, well, that's not scientific, though.
But I was asking the question in reference to truth. Can we know anything to be true 100%?
Not really, because, even and I'm not a mathematician, but my wife is,
mm-hmm.
There are, in fact, very, very complicated calculations and equations and things that you can use in mathematics using number theory that actually show that 2 + 2 = 5. You can actually do something like that in mathematics.
Zach, with all due respect, if leaving Christianity results in 2 + 2 becoming 5, mm-hmm. I've just found another reason to cling to Christ.
Well, that's mathematics. That's not Christianity.
What you're saying, no, in Christianity we have objective truth.
Okay.
We can know things to be true, mm-hmm. Because those things which are consistent, Jesus Christ said, "I am truth." So truth is really personified in the person of Christ.
Okay.
Everything that is consistent with Christ and His Word is true. Everything that is an objection or antithesis to Christ and His Word is seen as false or a lie. The world in which we live in is a world that is logically manifest. That is, we have reason manifest in understanding things in our theory of knowledge. We have reason manifest in our communication of language. We have reason manifest in our working with numbers, such as 2 + 2 = 4. These are all logical equations.
Sure.
And these are standards that men accept universally.
Right.
But in the evolutionary worldview, there is no such thing as a universal law. But yet, as a scientist, I'm sure that you would believe that there are things called laws, such as the law of gravity, the law of non-contradiction.
Oh, well, those are just descriptive laws, though. Those are just describing the nature of the universe.
But they're describing something.
Right.
And so it's language that is helpful to describe a reality.
For us. And in fact, they may be wrong.
So the law of contradiction might not exist, is that what you're saying?
It might not.
Well, once again, if abandoning Christianity, if abandoning the Christian worldview that teaches that there is a sovereign God who has endowed man with the ability to reason and to think and to have a relationship with Him, if abandoning that results in complete skepticism, then you really live in a world that for me is a crisis. I mean, you can't even know that you're talking to me on the phone right now.
Well, that's true. I mean, who's to say I even know that I'm alive? Maybe I'm a figment of your imagination.
But you just said that's true. So, is that true or is that not true? Is it true that you can't know that I'm talking to you on the phone right now? You see, what you're doing, Zachary, is you're made in the image of God, and so therefore you are assuming universal truths in the world in which you live, and you're even applying them in this conversation, but yet you're rejecting at the same time that there is something as universal truth.
Well, I'm not saying absolutely that I actually exist. I'm not saying that.
Okay.
Like I said, there is no such thing as absolute truth. I cannot know absolutely. I mean, I think I exist.
Okay. Well,
Can
let me
I
ask.
prove that I exist? Well, no. I mean,
is it true that there is no such thing as absolute truth? Because once again, you're borrowing the Christian worldview that teaches that there are universal truths, and you're making a statement about truth in a universal manner, but yet rejecting universal truth at the same time. It seems to me that you can't have it both ways.
Well, I'm also borrowing ancient Greek philosophy too. Not that I would say that I'm intersecting the Christian worldview. I'm not necessarily borrowing from it.
Okay, intersecting. Okay, that's a good description.
Okay.
But why are you intersecting? If the Christian worldview, according to you, has already been established as false because of your research.
No, I haven't. No, see, I'm not saying that it's false.
Okay.
I don't think it is. I don't think it's true. But you can't prove. You see what I'm saying?
Okay. When you say you can't prove, once again, you're assuming that there are things that can be proven. Are there things that can be proven?
I can't think of any. No.
So for you to say you can't prove the Christian worldview really is a meaningless statement.
Well, that's why I pretty much leave it alone. I mean, I say I don't think it's true. I'm not setting out to prove anything. I'm not setting out to prove that Christianity isn't true. I'm not setting out to prove that atheism is true. You know?
But you're saying that if somebody could prove to you that Christianity was true, then you would believe it.
How would they do that?
Well, that's what I'm asking you.
Well, that's my question too. And the fact that I haven't been able to figure out what that answer might be is pretty much the reason why I still am where I am.
Let me ask you this: do you have any children?
No.
Okay. Do you plan? Well, that question really is neither here nor there. I have 4 children.
Okay.
And I have a different background than you do. I was raised in a home where there was talk about God, but we never went to church. And I basically began to live out my sinful nature in my late teens and early 20s. And so I kind of come from the opposite of you. It seems that you were raised in a Christian home, but now you, by the experience of the reality in which you live, you've come to the conclusion that that's not the way to go. My experience was the opposite in that...
Well, I'm not saying that either. I'm not saying that Christianity isn't the way to go, necessarily. I'm saying that I don't think it's true. But I wouldn't see any problem with anybody else being a Christian.
Okay.
Either.
Well, that's good. But I'm sure that the website... xchristian.net. Talk to me more about the purpose in which you're a moderator on that website. Why do you take an interest in that website?
Well, I actually I came to all these conclusions that I've told you about long before I found this website. But I was just I'd always just kept these things to myself, and I don't know. I guess I'd sort of like argue in my own head. I like taking the devil's advocate point of view for just about everything. I love arguing. And
but you don't believe in the devil.
Well, it's
figure of speech, right? Okay.
So I'd just be thinking about these things and reading these books, and I didn't really have anybody to talk to. And so one day I went to the internet and I was like, okay, I got to find somebody out there who thinks like me, because I'd never met anybody. I'd never heard of anybody that had left the Christian faith before. And so I actually found a couple sites, losingmyreligion.com, whose motto, humorously enough, is "Stay home Sundays, save 10%." And then I found xchristian.net, and It's full of resources, lists of errancies in the Bible, lists of like atrocities. Basically, for people that are coming out of Christianity, it kind of fills in everything that they haven't been. I mean, they've been taught all the good things that Christianity has done, but they're not really aware of all the bad things.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of fills that in. And then there's a forum that allows you to, I guess, sort of like decompress, take out some of your frustrations. The analogy that we often use is that it's kind of like an Alcoholics Anonymous for people coming out of Christianity.
But when you compare to that, it seems to me that alcohol is something for those that are, have come to the point in their lives where they need to join AA. It's because it's basically wreaked havoc in their life. It's been something that's been destructive to them. But you don't believe that Christianity is necessarily destructive.
Not necessarily, but it can be. I mean, Christianity is a human. I do want to get across that I don't really have a problem with faith per se. Faith is actually a really good thing in general for humanity. All throughout history, mankind has had faith in all kinds of different things, and I think it's worked to basically his betterment. If religion was a bad thing, we definitely would have gotten rid of it by now. But it's not. And in fact, there's a book called Darwin's Cathedral. I can't remember the author offhand. But it basically talks about, it kind of fuses Darwinian selection and religious history and explains how religion actually tends to be good for society. And just faith in general. A really good example, Miracle on 34th Street. You familiar with that movie?
Yes, I am.
The little girl, and there's the guy that's supposed to be Santa Claus, and she does not believe that he's Santa Claus. But everybody who watches that movie wants her to believe that that guy is Santa Claus, even though everybody knows that he's not. But deep down, everybody kind of does think that he is Santa Claus when they watch the movie. So there's definitely a positive aspect to faith, and we really encourage faith. And while I don't necessarily have faith in the metaphysical anymore, I do have faith in, a lot of physical things. I have faith in myself. I have faith in humanity especially. So I've kind of moved away from, sort of like what you're saying, move away from the creator into the creature. Because I think that the creator is actually humanity, that God was actually created, or that the concept of God was created by humanity itself. So I'm kind of doing both.
A few minutes ago, you used the word atrocity. In your thinking, according to your worldview, what is atrocity?
Something that is immoral.
Okay.
Probably on a really large scale.
And what is, when you say immoral, based on what moral code or moral standard?
See, this is a problem that I had. This is actually one of the later problems that I had as I was leaving the faith. I'd acquired all this knowledge, and I'd acquired all these different perspectives on Christianity and the Bible. And I was really very confident that, there's really a lot more to it than, mainstream Christianity teaches. But I was still at a loss, and I'd heard this argument before that, you can't have morality outside the Bible. And it really bothered me because I knew that I knew what was right and wrong, but I couldn't think of why that was. And in fact, that's the argument C.S. Lewis uses in Mere Christianity to justify his belief in God. But then I discovered that, in fact, it is possible to have a moral system, a secular moral system, if you use humanity as the focus. And so in this system...
I wonder why one doesn't exist then.
Well, it does. In my opinion, it does. And where Christianity is good, or does good, is when it intersects with that secular human morality.
And what is that? Can you identify that secular human morality code for me?
Sure. What is good is to lessen human suffering, and what is bad is to increase human suffering.
Did you see the movie I, Robot?
Yes.
It's funny that you mention that, because it seems to me that's exactly what was going on in the movie. The robots had, Vicky, the main, if I can kind of digress for a moment, I'm sure a lot of our listeners haven't seen it, so let me set it up a little bit. Vicky was kind of like the mainframe, if you will, kind of like the master computer behind all the robots.
Right.
And the way that she was designed, she had the ability to begin to become human in some of her characteristics. Mm-hmm. She was gaining the ability to reason. She was gaining the ability to basically interpret the laws that were programmed in her from the beginning. In doing so, in watching this movie, I couldn't help but realize the parallel that you're talking about now. Because in the movie, if you recall, once the computer began to interpret the laws in a subjective manner, that is, the computer disconnected the laws from the original source by which they were given, that is man, and began to interpret them, he began to justify evil behavior toward men because he believed that his logic was infallible, since he could reason that it was better to take certain actions and protect man than allow man to have these freedoms by which man might destroy himself.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's actually a little bit closer to the ethical theory taught by John Stuart Mill.
Yes.
That's called utilitarianism.
Yes.
And a lot of people had objections to that theory, specifically for that. And Ursula Le Guin actually wrote a story called "Those Who Walk Away from Omelette," which is basically the same idea from iRobot. There's a city where everything is perfect, except for one child chosen at random. Gets tortured completely, and because of that torture, everybody else is made happy. But is it right for one person to suffer so that everybody else can be happy? And that just doesn't jive, with our ideas of justice. And so that's why ultimately utilitarianism failed as an ethical theory.
But I guess the question is, why doesn't it jive with your theory of justice?
Well, would you agree to live in a city where everything was perfect as long as one child at random was tortured continually? No,
but no. I would not agree to live there because I'm a Christian, and because according to my Christian worldview, I have an objective standard by which I can measure good and evil, and torturing innocent people is something that is evil. And I could say that very dogmatically and objectively.
Right, and I would say that I would not live there because that's causing unnecessary human suffering. So it goes against secular human morality.
But what's wrong with unnecessary human suffering in the evolutionary worldview?
Well, in the evolutionary
worldview, isn't that the survival of the fittest? I mean, if it makes the majority of the people better and happier and stronger, it seems to me that it would fit with the worldview.
Well, it's not the evolutionary; it's a human worldview.
But humans have evolved.
Yes.
In your understanding.
Right, but you can't apply this to other animals necessarily. I mean, you can't say it's wrong for a cat to kill. You can't say as a human that it's wrong for a cat to kill another cat, because it causes undue feline suffering. You can only apply this to humans. That's
because humans are made in the image of God. And the reason why you know that there is something right and there is something wrong, that there is something called truth, there is something called contradiction, Zachary, is because you were made in God's image. But you, like the men in Romans chapter 1, are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness and denying the very Creator who has endowed you with these gifts.
It's by virtue of these gifts that I'm denying Him. So.
It's kind of like if I can use an analogy. Mm-hmm. In order for a 2-year-old to slap his grandfather in the face, the grandfather has to pick up the 2-year-old and hold him. And so when you say it's by these gifts, or these quote-unquote gifts that I have, that I am denying him, that's exactly what you're doing. You have no foundation for the gifts or the abilities that you have in an evolutionary worldview where God is removed.
Oh, sure I do.
Okay, well, what is the foundation for your morality? Is it just consensus?
Well, you have to start with some axiomatic assumptions.
Why?
Preferably as few as possible. Well, you have to start with something. Or else
so why is my axiomatic assumption of the Christian God not a good starting point?
Well, I'm not saying that it is necessarily, but it's just one more than you need. You're just assuming one more thing than I do. See, we basically assume the same things, except you also assume that there is a God.
Yes.
So I haven't found a reason to make that assumption.
Well, let me...
Or I've lost my reason for making it.
Okay. Are you saying then that a consensus of human beings living in a society is what establishes morality?
No.
Okay, then how is morality established?
Well, it's just one of those it's based on the axioms. They're self-evident. You don't have to agree to them. And you certainly don't have to vote on them.
They're self-evident, Zach, because you're made in the image of God. Can't you see that?
No. They're self-evident because I'm a human. And I exist, and I know I'm aware that I exist, and I know that I don't want to die. I know that that's a bad thing. So I can apply that to all other humans that are in existence and say, well, if I don't want to die, then they certainly don't want to die either. So it would be bad for me to cause them to suffer or kill them or whatever.
Zach, why don't you want to die?
I don't know. I just don't.
Do you enjoy life that much?
Yeah. Well, that's the purpose of life, is to live it. I mean,
purpose implies purpose giver.
Not necessarily.
It seems to me, Zach, and it seems to me that just about every sentence out of your mouth has what you called an intersection with the Christian God.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, Christianity has grown up in a human setting also, so there's bound to be lots of intersections.
But
I mean,
these are intersections that cannot be accounted for outside of the Christian worldview.
Oh, sure they can.
Okay, let's just narrow this down. We're running out of time. Let's narrow this down to one. Do you believe that there is something called the laws of logic?
Yeah, as far as practical use is concerned, yeah.
Okay. Where do these laws come from?
They just exist.
They just exist. So your axiomatic is that the laws of logic just exist.
Yeah.
And that is somehow more reasonable to you than a God who creates men in his own image and gives them the ability to reason and makes them reasonable beings so that they might be able to reason in the world that they live in and come to an understanding of the God who made them.
Well, it's a lot easier for me to look at an apple and an orange on the table and say, well, an apple is not an orange, than it is for me to conceive of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent deity, and all the things that are supposed to have happened in the Bible. It's a lot easier for my brain to wrap around that.
Okay. Well, Zach, I've enjoyed the conversation, and maybe we can pick it up and talk some more in the future.
Absolutely, anytime.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Are you available next Tuesday?
Sure.
All right, well, let's continue this next Tuesday on The Narrow Mind.
Okay.
Okay, Zach,
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Well, there you have it. Zachery Moore, raised in a Reformed home. It sounds like he had good parents that were concerned about his spiritual health, concerned about his spiritual welfare. But now, because of his education, and quite frankly, his education that came from the university, he has now left the faith. But my observation has been that he's still assuming the Christian worldview. He's still assuming the Christian worldview in the way he speaks and the way he thinks, and he can't escape it. And the reason why he can't escape it is because the Christian worldview is truth. All of us are made in the image of God, and because we are made in the image of God, we carry certain attributes that God has given human beings that alone belong to Him. He hasn't given these attributes to animals. He hasn't given them to plants, but He's given them to us because we've been made in His image. At the same time, we have raised our fist in mutiny, and we have raised our fist to the God who has made us and resisted everything good that He has given us in this world. All of us at some point have done this. And yet God has been gracious to condescend to mankind in the person of Christ, that some of these selfish, unappreciative, self-centered human beings might be saved and might be spared the very justice that we deserve. What a gracious God we have. If you're a Christian out there and you're listening to this webcast, you need to pray for Zachery. You need to pray for your own children, because it may be that one day your child, your son or daughter, adopts the worldview that Zachery has adopted. I'm sure he has parents that are praying for him on a regular basis. And I tell you what, it just breaks my heart to see men and women rejecting God, rejecting Christ, when I have come to know Him as such a loving and gracious Savior. May God be gracious to all of us. May God be merciful to His enemies. Until next week, this has been The Narrow Mind. My name is Gene Cook.